Paraplegic millionaire lived in sorrow until hiring a gardener who stunned her day one truly. Before the story begins, wherever life has placed you today, this message is for you. The morning Marcus Hale pulled his rusted Ford pickup through the iron gates of 14 Birchwood Lane. The fog was so thick he could barely see the mansion at the end of the driveway. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands, calloused, soil-darkened hands that had known more seasons of earth than of comfort, and exhaled slowly through his nose. The address on the paper matched. The gate code had worked. And yet something about this place made the hairs on the back of his neck rise the way they did before a storm. He parked near the side of the house, away from the grand entrance the way his mother had always taught him. You go in through the garden door, Marcus, never the front, not until you're invited. He never was, not in 33 years, but that had never stopped him from doing beautiful work. The estate was enormous, easily 12,000 square feet of white stone and black shuttered windows set against 3 acres of grounds that had clearly not been properly tended in years. Overgrown boxwoods crowded the stone walkways. Ivy had crept up the iron railings of the side terrace, choking the posts. A rose garden near the east wall had gone completely wild, canes arching in every direction like something wounded trying to reach the sky. Marcus stood at the edge of the property for a long moment, holding his coffee thermos, the one his daughter Lily had painted with bright yellow sunflowers when she was 5, and he took it all in. Not with the eye of a man who saw work, with the eye of a man who saw a story. Every garden told one. This one told of a place that had been abandoned not by laziness, but by grief. He opened the back of his truck and began unloading his tools with quiet efficiency. Pruning shears, a flat spade, the hand trowel he'd had since he was 19, and had sharpened so many times the blade had grown thin and elegant like a letter opener. He set his worn leather gloves on the truck bed and looked up at the house one more time. A light was on in a room on the second floor. Just one. Behind glass so clean it looked like the window had been removed entirely. And in that window, still as a painting, was a silhouette. A woman, sitting without moving, watching him. Marcus gave a single respectful nod in that direction, then pulled on his gloves and went to work. He had learned about the job 3 days ago through a handwritten index card tacked to the board at Henley's Hardware in town. Estate gardener needed. Immediate start. Experience required. References preferred. Ask for Mrs. Pruitt. Mrs. Pruitt, he discovered when he called, was the estate's housekeeper, a sharp-voiced woman in her 60s who made it clear within the first 30 seconds of conversation that the owner of the property was a private person and that he was not to disturb her under any circumstances. He was to arrive at 7, park near the side, work the grounds, leave by 4, cash payment each Friday. Does the owner have any preferences for the garden? Marcus had asked. A pause so long he thought the line had gone dead. She used to, Mrs. Pruitt said finally, and then she hung up. He didn't ask what that meant. He had learned long ago that the most important things in life were rarely explained, only felt if you were paying the right kind of attention. Now, moving along the stone path toward the overgrown East Terrace, Marcus began to understand the particular silence of this place. It wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a held breath, of something, or someone, that had been waiting for a very long time for something they no longer believed would come. He crouched at the base of an old wisteria that had been trained along a rusted iron pergola and examined the wood. The vine itself was healthy, just neglected. With the right pruning, it would bloom again by late spring. He looked further along the terrace and noticed something that stopped him cold. The stone path, beautiful old Connecticut bluestone, probably original to the house, ended abruptly at the base of 3 wide steps leading down into the sunken garden. No ramp, no alternative path, just steps. And beyond those steps, the most breathtaking part of the grounds, a circular garden with an old stone fountain at its center, surrounded by what had once been a carefully curated planting of lavender, salvia, and old garden roses. Now overgrown, now unreachable. He stood there for a moment, very still. Then he took out a small worn notebook from his breast pocket and began to sketch. By 9 in the morning, Mrs. Pruitt appeared at the side door of the house. A compact woman with silver hair pulled back severely, wearing a starched navy apron. She looked at Marcus the way people look at weather, trying to determine what it would bring. "You're Marcus Hale?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at his truck, his tools, the notes he'd made. "You were told to start on the front hedges." "I will," he said. "I just wanted to understand the whole property first." She studied him for a moment with eyes that had clearly seen every variety of person this world had to offer. "Don't go near the East Terrace door," she said finally. "That's her sitting room. She doesn't like—" She paused. "She doesn't like to be startled." "I understand." Another long look. Then Mrs. Pruitt went back inside. Marcus spent the morning on the front hedges, bringing them back to clean lines with a patience that came as naturally to him as breathing. He worked without music, without his phone, just the sound of his shears and the birds returning to the branches he was clearing. Around 11 he heard the soft whir of a motor behind him. He didn't turn around immediately. He finished the cut he was making, then stepped back to assess the line, and only then turned with the same quiet ease he brought to everything. She was on the stone terrace, about 20 feet behind him, in a sleek black power wheelchair that moved with near-silent precision. She was younger than he'd expected, late 20s maybe. Dark hair pulled back from a face that was striking in the way that great architecture is striking. Not immediately soft, but structured and bold, with eyes the color of deep water that were currently fixed on him with an expression he recognized instantly. He'd seen it on Lily once, when she'd watched older children at the playground from the fence because she'd been afraid to go in. It was the look of someone who wanted something and had long since convinced themselves they couldn't have it. Vanessa Cole said nothing. She simply looked at the garden, at the wild roses past the steps she could not descend, at the fountain she could not reach, and Marcus watched her face, just for a moment, before looking away with the same respect he gave to things that were in pain. He went back to work. He did not speak to her. He did not wave or nod or perform the kind of awkward deference that strangers usually aimed at her like it was kindness. He simply worked, and let the garden be a thing they were both present for, without demand. After perhaps 10 minutes, he heard the wheelchair motor again. She had gone back inside. He stood alone in the quiet for a moment and looked at the sunken garden, at the fountain, still and gray, surrounded by wildness. Then he looked at the stone steps. He looked at his truck, at the lumber he always kept in the back for unexpected repairs, at the sandbags and the gravel. He was quiet for a long moment. Then Marcus Hale made a decision that he didn't put into words even inside his own mind. He simply reached for his notebook and started measuring. By 3:30 that afternoon, working with the focused intensity of a man who had found his purpose in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, Marcus had built the beginning of a gently sloping ramp of compacted gravel and landscape timber along the south edge of the terrace steps. It wasn't finished. It would take another day, maybe 2. But it was solid, well pitched, and would hold. He'd lined the edge with flat stones from a surplus pile he found near the potting shed. Stones that matched the existing bluestone path so closely, they might have been cut from the same quarry. He packed up his tools at 10 to 4. He left without telling anyone what he'd done or why. He didn't mention it to Mrs. Pruitt. He didn't leave a note. He picked up Lily from the Hendersons' house, the retired couple 2 streets over who watched her on his workdays, and she immediately climbed into the truck and pressed her small nose against his jacket and announced that he smelled like outside. "Good outside or bad outside?" he asked. She considered this very seriously. She was a serious child, with his dark eyes and her late mother's stubborn mouth. "Good outside," she said. "Like before a rainstorm." "That's the best kind," he said. She fell asleep on his shoulder before they were even out of town. He drove home in the dark with one hand on the wheel and one hand resting gently on the top of her head, her hair soft against his palm, and he thought about a stone fountain surrounded by wild roses and a woman watching it from behind glass like it was a world she had been locked out of. He thought about the ramp, still unfinished. He thought, by tomorrow afternoon, it will be done. And somewhere on the second floor of 14 Birchwood Lane, Vanessa Cole sat at her window in the dark long after her housekeeper had gone to bed and stared at the shape of the new path where no path had been before. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't known to ask, and that more than anything was what was keeping her awake. Vanessa Cole had not always been still. There was a version of her, and she remembered this version the way you remember a house you grew up in that has since burned down, with a kind of aching photographic precision, who moved through the world like weather, fast and certain and not particularly interested in what stood in her way. At 22, she had graduated top of her class at Wharton. At 24, she had taken her late father's floundering medical tech firm, Cole Dynamics, and transformed it from a company hemorrhaging capital into one that landed on the cover of Forbes with the headline, "The youngest female CEO in medtech history." At 26, she had been in the middle of closing the largest acquisition deal in her company's history when the car hit her. She didn't talk about the accident. Not to journalists who had tried. Not to the therapists her board had insisted on. Not to her mother, who had sat beside her hospital bed for 6 weeks and wept quietly every morning before Vanessa was awake, not knowing that her daughter heard everything. Not to the 2 men who had said they loved her, both of whom had been unable to hold the weight of who she had become afterward and had left, one after 3 months and one after 8, both with apologies that made her feel more alone than the leaving itself. What Vanessa had, instead of words, was the window. The east-facing sitting room on the 2nd floor of the Birchwood estate had the best view of the grounds. She had bought this house 2 years ago, 6 months after being discharged from the rehabilitation center in Boston, where she had spent the most difficult year of her life learning, among other things, how to grieve the body she had once lived in. She had bought it because of that view, because she had stood, with the use of the standing frame, one of her last sessions before discharge, at a realtor's window and looked out at the gardens and felt, for the first time in 14 months, something other than nothing. She had imagined in that moment walking those paths, sitting by that fountain, feeling the sun on that particular west-facing bench near the old yew tree. She had not yet fully absorbed the truth of what her new life meant spatially, what steps meant, what uneven ground meant, what a garden designed by someone who had never considered the idea of access truly meant to a person in a power chair. She understood now. She had understood for 2 years, standing at the glass, watching the grounds go wild, because every gardener she had hired had come with clipboards and questions and looks that made her feel she needed to perform competence to justify her instructions. And she had grown so tired of performing anything for anyone that eventually she stopped answering their calls, and Mrs. Pruitt had to let them all go. Marcus Hale was different. She had watched him from the window yesterday, and then again from the terrace, and he had done something none of the others had done. Nothing. That is to say, he had done his work, and he had not looked at her as though she were something that needed to be handled. He had simply let her be present. The way you let a bird land near you when you're sitting very still in a garden, because you know that the slightest wrong move will send it away. She was thinking about this at 6:45 in the morning, when she heard the sound of his truck pulling through the gate. She did not go to the window. She had a 7 o'clock call with her COO, David Park, about the quarterly projections, and she was already in her home office, a room she had designed with obsessive precision so that every surface, every switch, every element of her professional world was reachable, manageable, hers. She ran Cole Dynamics from this house entirely. Her board had accommodated this, not without friction, but they had accommodated it because the alternative was losing her. And whatever else had changed about Vanessa Cole's life, her mind had not changed at all. "The Denver partnership is the concern," David was saying through the screen. "Harriman doesn't think we can close before Q2. Harriman is wrong," Vanessa said without particular heat. "The leverage is in the licensing clause, not the equity stake. Send me the latest draft tonight. I'll annotate." David nodded slowly. He was a good man, David, steady and careful and tactfully honest. "How are you feeling?" he asked, in the tone of someone who had learned to ask but not to push. "I'm fine," she said. After the call, she sat for a while in the silence of her office, in the precise, controlled world she had built around herself, and listened. She could hear, faintly through the walls, the sound of work being done outside, the rhythmic scrape of a tool against stone. Patient. Unhurried. She made her way to the sitting room. He was down on the terrace, crouched beside the south edge where the steps met the path, his back to her. He was laying flat stones with the same focus she gave to contract language, testing each piece, adjusting, testing again. Beside him, the timber frame of the ramp she had seen last night was being fitted now with a surface of compacted, decomposed granite, smooth and stable. He had been thinking about this overnight. She understood, in a way she did not examine too closely, that this was what that meant. He had gone home, and he had continued thinking about the problem of her garden. Without being asked, without being paid for that thinking. He had simply held the problem gently in his mind and returned this morning with a solution in his hands. She watched him work for a long time. He didn't look up. The ramp grew slowly, precisely, into a thing of real functional grace, fitting the existing stonework so naturally that it looked, from a certain angle, as though it had always been there. As though the garden itself had always intended this path and had only been waiting for someone with the right eyes to see it. At 11:10, she heard a small sound from below near the service entrance. A voice she did not recognize. Light, small. A child's voice. "Daddy, can I come?" And then his voice. Deeper, warm in a way that surprised her through the window glass. 5 minutes, Bug. Stay on the path." Vanessa rolled closer to the window. A girl appeared at the corner of the terrace. 6 years old, perhaps. Skinny and dark-haired and dressed in bright yellow rubber boots that were clearly too large for her feet and made her walk with an endearing, wide-footed shuffle. She carried a thin stick she had clearly just found, which she held out in front of her like a scepter. She walked directly to where Marcus was working and stood beside him and studied the ramp with the grave focus of a small engineer. "Is it a slide?" she asked. "It is not a slide," he said, without looking up from his work. She considered this. "Can it be a slide later?" "It cannot." "What is it?" He paused then and looked at her with quiet patience. "It's a path," he said, "so someone who couldn't get to the garden before can get there now." Lily looked at the ramp, then out at the sunken garden beyond the steps, the fountain, the wild roses, the lavender gone to seed. She was quiet for a moment in the way that children are sometimes quiet, when they are feeling something they don't have words for yet. "That's nice, Daddy," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." Vanessa turned away from the window. She pressed the heels of her hands against the armrests of her chair and sat in the middle of her sitting room surrounded by all the things she owned and she felt, pulling at the back of her chest like a tide, something she had spent 2 years building very careful walls against. She cried, briefly and without sound, the way she had learned to in the hospital, and then she stopped and straightened and looked at herself with clear eyes in the mirror across the room, the mirror she kept there specifically for that purpose, to remind herself who she was, and she decided something. At 12:30 she told Mrs. Pruitt to bring lunch for 2 to the East Terrace. When Mrs. Pruitt looked at her in a way that contained about 14 questions, Vanessa simply said, "Please, Margaret." The use of her first name alone was enough. Mrs. Pruitt nodded and went to the kitchen. By the time Marcus came up to clean his tools for the lunch hour, there was a small folding table on the terrace, set with plates. And Vanessa Cole was already outside, at the top of the ramp he had built, in the thin November sun, waiting. She did not say thank you right away. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and it was the first time they had looked at each other directly. Not from behind glass, not across 20 feet of garden. Close. Clear. "The ramp isn't in the contract," she said. "No," he agreed. "You didn't ask." "No." She studied him for a long moment with those deep water eyes. "Why?" He was quiet for a breath. Then he said simply, honestly, "Because it should have been there before." And Vanessa Cole, who had not had lunch outside in 2 years, looked away toward the garden and said, "Sit down, Mr. Hale." He sat. Lily appeared at the corner of the terrace again, yellow boots and all, and looked at the table with the focused hope of a child who smells food. Vanessa looked at her, the dark eyes, the mud on the boots, the small, serious face. "You can sit too," Vanessa said, in a tone that was not unkind, though it was still learning how to be warm. Lily turned to her father for confirmation. He gave a small nod. She climbed into the chair beside him with careful dignity. The three of them sat in the November light and ate Mrs. Pruitt's soup and did not say a great deal, but what was said was honest. The weather, the wisteria, whether lavender would survive being cut back this late in the season, and the silence between the words was the good kind. The kind that means something is being built. Below them, the path Marcus had made led down into the sunken garden where the fountain stood, still and waiting, surrounded by wildness. Tomorrow, Vanessa thought, she would go down there. She had not let herself think that thought in 2 years, and now it moved through her with the quiet surprise of a door she had forgotten existed. Found unlocked. She looked across the table at the man who had opened it, who was currently engaged in a serious conversation with his daughter about whether the stick she'd found was magical. All sticks are a little magical, he was saying. It depends on what you're looking for. Lily seemed satisfied with this. She put the stick carefully in her boot for safekeeping. Vanessa looked down at her soup. Something in her chest, something that had been frozen for a very long time, shifted almost imperceptibly toward the light. She did not name it. Not yet. But it was there. For the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, Vanessa set an alarm. Not for a conference call, not for a board meeting, not for the twice-weekly physical therapy sessions she had with Daniel Reyes, who drove up from Hartford every Tuesday and Thursday with his calm hands and his implacable professional cheer. She set it for 6:15 in the morning because Marcus Hale arrived at 7, and she wanted to be ready. Not in the sense of performance, but in the sense of being fully present when the day began, which was a distinction she had only recently come to understand the importance of. She was in the sitting room by 6:50, coffee in hand, watching the fog lift slowly off the grounds, when his truck came through the gate. What happened over the next 11 days changed things. Not loudly. Not in the way that change usually announced itself in Vanessa's life, with deadlines and term sheets and rooms full of people watching to see how she handled herself. This change happened the way plants grew, invisibly, in the dark and the cold, the alteration so gradual that you could only see it by looking away and looking back. By comparing the garden now to the garden before and understanding in the gap between those two images that something irreversible had occurred. Marcus finished the ramp on the second day. It was everything she had observed from the window it would be. Clean, solid, well fitted to the existing bluestone as if placed there by the original architect with exactly this purpose in mind. He lined it on both sides with low, rounded stones from the property's own surplus pile, and installed a simple iron handrail along the left edge that he had sourced, she later discovered, from a salvage yard in Torrington, because it matched the period of the house. He had not told her he was doing this. He had not presented it for approval. He had simply understood that it needed to be right, and he had made it right. When she rolled down the ramp for the first time on the morning of the third day, the gravel compact and firm beneath her wheels, the handrail cool and solid within reach, and felt the ground of the sunken garden beneath her for the first time, felt it as a place she occupied rather than a place she observed. She did not cry. She had done her crying already. What she felt was quieter than that, and more permanent, the specific quality of return, of arriving somewhere you had already arrived, but now arriving as yourself. She sat beside the fountain for 20 minutes. The water was off. Marcus had said the pump needed work, but the basin was clean and pale, and the sky above it was the high winter blue of mid-November, and the wild roses crowded the outer ring in their bare architectural grace, their canes reaching in every direction. And she breathed. Marcus worked around her without comment, pruning the roses back with careful attention, never crowding her, never performing the solicitousness that she had come to dread from every well-meaning person in her life. He simply worked. Nearby, present, and she sat, and breathed, and was present in return. This became, without either of them discussing it, a kind of rhythm. He worked the grounds in expanding sections, East Terrace to sunken garden to the wide back lawn where a kitchen garden had once grown and could again. He cleared the overgrown boxwoods into clean shapes. He freed the wisteria from its decade of wild growth and trained it back along the pergola with careful ties. He tested the soil in 4 locations and came to her with his findings as he might to a landowner with strong preferences, which she was, which she had just forgotten she was allowed to be, and asked what she wanted. Lavender? He'd noted her chair had stood near the existing lavender beds both mornings. Roses? The old varieties tolerated shade and came back reliably. A small cutting garden perhaps near the kitchen entrance for Mrs. Pruitt. The last suggestion made her smile, which seemed to startle him slightly and then settle him, the way light settling into a room settles you. Mrs. Pruitt would say she doesn't want one, Vanessa said. I know, he said. She'd be wrong. They looked at each other. Something passed between them, not yet named, but real. On the 6th day, Lily came again. She came on some days and not others, depending on arrangements Marcus made quietly, and her presence had a particular quality that Vanessa found herself unprepared for, and then, gradually, simply present to. The child moved through the world with the focused curiosity of someone who had recently arrived and found everything interesting. She collected stones with specific shapes. She talked to the roses, low and private, clearly not expecting a response but offering one courtesy anyway. She sat beside her father while he worked and drew in a small spiral notebook with a set of markers that were her most prized possession. On the 6th day, she came to Vanessa with the notebook open to a page of green and brown and sky blue color, pressed flat and offered with the gravity of a significant gift. It's the garden, Lily said, from up high, like a bird. Vanessa looked at it. It was not by any objective measure technically accomplished. The fountain was a brown oval, the rose beds green and red scribbles, the ramp a careful brown line, the path branching to the various sections Marcus had cleared. But it was spatially accurate in a way that surprised her. The proportions were roughly right, the relationships between elements were observed, and in the center of the composition, Lily had drawn 2 small figures, a tall one near the roses and a smaller one in a shape that might have been a rounded chair. Vanessa looked at the drawing for a long moment. Her throat tightened. This is very good, she said. I know, said Lily, without false modesty. Marcus, overhearing from a few feet away, looked at the sky to hide a smile. Vanessa kept the drawing. She put it in her office on the desk where she spent the better part of her days, beside the family photograph and the small bronze paperweight that had been her father's. She didn't analyze why. She simply put it there. On the 8th day, she asked him about his wife. It was less a planned question than the surfacing of something she had noticed. The absence. The singular shape of his life with Lily. The particular self-sufficiency of a man who had learned to carry more than his share. He was quiet for a moment, working the edge of a new bed along the south wall. Her name was Claire, he said. She died when Lily was 8 months old. Heart. Nobody knew. I'm sorry, Vanessa said. It was the truest 2 words she knew. Yeah. A pause, then. She would have liked this place. She liked old things that still had life in them. He said it plainly, without soliciting a response. But he glanced at her as he said it, briefly and without calculation. And she understood that the statement had more than one meaning, and he was not unaware of that. She looked away toward the fountain. The pump had been repaired now. Marcus had done it on the 5th day, without mentioning it, simply arriving with the part needed and coming inside briefly through the service entrance to access the mechanism. And the water moved in a steady circle over the pale stone, its sound gentle and continuous in the quiet air. She had discovered she could hear it from her sitting room window when she left the window open, even in the cold, and she had been leaving it open. My father built a garden, she said after a while. She hadn't intended to say anything. The words came as words sometimes did now. Around him, less guarded. At the house in Greenwich where I grew up, not like this, smaller. He did it himself on weekends. He used to say... She stopped. What? Marcus asked quietly. She looked at her hands on the armrests of her chair. He said a garden was the only place where the work you did always looked like more than work. Like it turned into something else. Marcus straightened and looked at the garden they were both in. The recovered paths, the training wisteria, the lavender bed now cleared and waiting for spring, the fountain moving at the center of it all. Yeah, he said. That's right. She looked up at him. The November light was flat and clear, and in it he looked like a man who had been exactly here, in this place, doing exactly this work, for a very long time, as if the garden had been waiting not for a gardener but specifically for him, and had known the difference. It was the 8th day of knowing him. She was aware in a way she was not accustomed to being aware of things she could not put on a spreadsheet, that something had shifted in her irrevocably, that the careful architecture of distance she had built around her life had somewhere in the last 8 days developed a door, that the door was open. She was afraid. She had not been afraid of very many things in her life. She had been afraid in the hospital, afraid in the dark, afraid in the long, silent months after. And she recognized this particular fear because it wasn't about danger. It was about possibility. The fear of possibility was the specific fear of someone who had learned, at great cost, not to want things. She wanted things. She wanted the fountain sound through the open window. She wanted Lily's map drawing on her desk. She wanted the lavender to come back in spring. She wanted to still be here when it did. She wanted him to come back tomorrow. None of this she said. But she thought it all, sitting in the thin winter light in the garden that was slowly coming back to life, listening to the sound of work being done nearby, careful and patient, and good. And on the 9th day, this she did not yet know, though she would remember it later as the day everything became inevitable, Marcus Hale would find something in the old potting shed that would change everything both of them thought they understood about this property, and about each other. But that was tomorrow. Tonight he would pack his tools, and Lily would find one more perfect stone, and Mrs. Pruitt would bring chamomile tea to the sitting room without being asked. And Vanessa would sit at her open window in the cold night air, listening to the fountain, holding a small drawing of a garden as seen by a 6-year-old from the height of a bird, and feel, for the first time in 2 years, that the distance between herself and the world was not a permanent condition, that it was closing, one careful, unhurried step at a time. The potting shed sat at the far northeast corner of the property, half hidden behind an overgrown privet hedge that Marcus had been working back in sections over the past week. It was a small structure, maybe 12 by 14 feet, built of the same white stone as the main house, with a cedar shake roof that had seen better decades and a wooden door so swollen with moisture, it required a firm shoulder to open. Mrs. Pruitt had mentioned it only once in passing. Tools in the shed. You're welcome to anything useful, the rest is just old things. He had taken her at her word and not yet gone in, working instead from the supplies in his own truck and the larger tool storage bay near the garage. On the 9th day, he finally pushed the door open. The light came in behind him, thin and gray, and fell across a space that smelled of cedar and old soil, and something else, something dry and papery, like books left in an attic. Along the left wall, the expected, terracotta pots in descending stacks, a rusted cultivator, coils of old hose, a trowel with a cracked handle. Along the right wall, a potting bench with a cracked porcelain sink, and below the bench, stacked flat and covered with a piece of oilcloth that had been placed with clear, deliberate care, a series of large objects he didn't immediately recognize. He crouched and lifted the edge of the cloth. Drawings. Architectural drawings done by hand on large drafting paper. He lifted one carefully and brought it to the light in the doorway. It was a garden plan. This garden, identifiable by the shape of the sunken section and the placement of the fountain, though drawn in a state of vision rather than reality. Beds curved and flowed with an organic generosity that the current garden only hinted at. A pergola draped in roses connected the east terrace to a small pavilion he hadn't seen any evidence of, then looked out and realized he had seen the foundation, half buried under the overgrown privet, and hadn't known what it was. He turned the drawing over. In the lower right corner, in precise draftsman's lettering, Garden Plan, Birchwood Lane, R. Cole, 1987, R. Cole. He stood very still in the doorway of the potting shed and looked at the drawing in his hands. Then he looked toward the house at the sitting room window where the light was on. He went back to the bench and carefully lifted each drawing in turn. There were 11 in total, spanning from 1985 to 1991, an evolving vision of the same garden, each iteration more developed than the last, a man refining his dream across 6 years. Some were annotated with plant names, variety numbers, spacing notes. One had a small watercolor wash laid over the pencil lines in faded greens and roses and lavenders, and the quality of the color, even aged as it was, told Marcus that whoever had done this had possessed a real eye, had loved this. The last drawing, dated 1991, was different from the others. It was the most complete version of the garden vision, but in the margin, in a different hand, rounder, less certain, clearly a child's careful printing, were the words, "My garden too." V. Marcus sat down on the low stool near the potting bench and looked at that small notation for a long time. V. Vanessa. She would have been, he did quick arithmetic, about 5 or 6 years old in 1991, old enough to claim something, old enough to mean it. He thought about what she had told him on the 8th day. My father built a garden. And the thing she had quoted. A garden was the only place where the work you did always looked like more than work. He thought about the way her voice had changed when she said it. Not the controlled, precise voice of the CEO, but something younger. Something that had been carefully stored for a long time in a room she rarely opened. He thought about a little girl pressing a small hand to a drafting table and printing her name in the margin of her father's dream. He thought about the fact that Vanessa Cole had bought this house, this specific house, and had not, as far as he could tell, ever mentioned that she had any connection to it. Had not mentioned her father's drawings sleeping in the potting shed, had not, he was fairly certain now, known they were here. He placed the drawings back exactly as he had found them, covered them with the oilcloth, and walked back toward the house. Mrs. Pruitt was in the kitchen. He knocked at the open door frame and she looked up from the counter with her usual expression of watchful reserve. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said, "how long has this property been in Ms. Cole's ownership?" 2 years, she said. She bought it from the Harriman estate. He felt something careful shift in his chest. "Before the Harrimans. Do you know the history?" She studied him for a moment. It changed hands several times over the years. Before the Harrimans, it was a family called Whitmore. Before that, she paused. I believe it was owned by a Cole, an earlier Cole. I never connected the names until much later. I'm not sure she knows. Marcus was quiet. "The potting shed," he said. "There are drawings under the bench. Old ones. Architectural garden plans." Mrs. Pruitt set down her dish towel very slowly. "Signed R. Cole," he said. "From the 80s. She looked at him for a long moment, and in her eyes he saw that she understood instantly what this meant, and that she was weighing something with the careful calculation of a person who had spent a great many years protecting someone they loved from pain. Then her expression settled into something that was not quite peace, but was a decision. "She should know," she said quietly. "She should have known a long time ago." He nodded. "I'll leave that to you," he said. "I just thought she should be the one to go into that shed first, not me." Mrs. Pruitt looked at him for a long moment in a way she had not looked at him before, with the specific rare attention of someone revising their understanding of a person upward. "You're a good man, Mr. Hale," she said. He shook his head gently. "Just trying to do the work right," he said. He went back to the garden. He did not tell Vanessa. He worked the rest of the day with the steady focus of someone carrying something carefully, and when she came out to the terrace in the early afternoon with 2 cups of coffee and the relaxed, open quality she had gradually moved into over the past week and a half, he was simply present with her, and present to the garden, and present to the particular quality of this day. Its cold, clear light, the sound of the fountain, the wisteria bare and patient along the pergola. He wanted to tell her. He found himself looking at her and feeling the weight of what was coiled inside that potting shed, the inheritance she didn't know she had, the thread connecting her to this place that ran deeper than a real estate transaction. He wanted to hand it to her the way he had handed her the ramp, without ceremony, but with care. But this was not his to give. This was hers to find. And there was a difference. What he gave her instead was simpler, he had brought bulbs, paper whites and early crocus and a variety of old-fashioned Dutch iris that he'd found at the nursery in Litchfield. the kind that came back year after year without fussing. He showed her where he planned to plant them along the south edge of the sunken garden and along the path from the ramp. They won't show anything before March, he said. Maybe April for the iris. That's fine, she said. And then a beat later, I'll be here in April. She said it simply, but he heard in it what she meant. I intend to be here. I am making plans that extend to April. I am building a future in which this garden exists, and I am in it. He had not heard her speak about the future before. He had noticed that absence. He looked at her. She was looking at the south bed, already visualizing something. Her face was open in the way it had become open, gradually, over 11 days. A quality of expression he thought of privately as her real face, distinct from the composed, careful face she wore for the world, and infinitely more beautiful. He said nothing. He planted the bulbs. That evening, after he left, Mrs. Pruitt went to Vanessa's sitting room and sat down across from her, which she had not done, simply sat without a tray or an errand, in years. And she told her about the drawings in the potting shed. Vanessa sat very still while she listened. When Mrs. Pruitt finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Outside, the fountain ran its gentle circle in the dark. He found them, Vanessa said finally, and didn't say anything to me. He thought it should come from someone who knew you, Mrs. Pruitt said. Or from you yourself. Another silence. My father sold this house in 1993, Vanessa said. I was 7. I cried for a week. I told my mother I wanted to go back. She said we couldn't. A pause. I looked for it for years. I didn't know how to search for it properly until I was older. By the time I had the resources to find it and buy it. She stopped. I didn't know the drawings were here. I thought everything was gone. Mrs. Pruitt reached across and took her hand. He planted bulbs today, Vanessa said, almost to herself. Along the south path, he said they'll come up in April. Yes, said Mrs. Pruitt. My father planted bulbs in that bed, Vanessa said. I helped him. I was maybe 5. I don't know how Marcus would know that. He wouldn't, Mrs. Pruitt said gently. He just saw what the bed needed. Vanessa looked at their joined hands. She thought about a man who looked at a garden and saw its story, who saw a path that should have been there and built it, who found her father's drawings and said nothing, so that she could find them herself. She thought, I am in serious trouble. And for the first time in a very long time, trouble felt like something she wanted. She went to the potting shed the next morning before Marcus arrived. Alone, in the cold gray pre-dawn, with a flashlight and her chair and the careful focus of someone approaching something sacred. She pushed the door open. It required exactly the same firm shoulder he had given it, and moved inside, and found the oilcloth without difficulty and lifted it. She looked at her father's drawings for a long time in the beam of her flashlight. Robert Cole had been an architect by training, and a businessman by necessity, taking over his own father's medical equipment company in his 30s before the industry had become what Vanessa would later transform it into. But architecture had been his love, the shaping of space, the conversation between structure and the human body moving through it. He had given it up mostly for the company, but he had kept the garden. He had planned it the way he might have planned a building, with that same care for dimension and proportion, and the way light would fall at different times of day. She found the drawing from 1991. She found the margin notation in her own childhood hand. My garden too, V. She pressed her fingertips gently to those letters, and she allowed herself for a private minute in the cold potting shed, to be 7 years old and heartbroken, and then to come back from that completely. To be 28 in full possession of herself, sitting in a garden that was becoming finally what it was always meant to be. Her father had died when she was 19. She had not been able to save him, which was part of why she had spent the decade after in a relentless effort to build a company that saved other people in a very different sense. She understood this about herself. She had understood it for a while, but she had never, until this moment, understood that the garden was also part of it, that this specific garden, this particular purchase, was not the logical real estate decision she had told herself and her board it was. It was something else. Something a 7-year-old had decided. In the wordless way children decide the things that shape them. I want to go back. She covered the drawings with the oilcloth and placed them exactly as she found them. Then she went back inside to her office and sat for 20 minutes in the particular stillness of someone who has just understood something about themselves that reorganizes the furniture of the interior life. Marcus arrived at 7. She was on the terrace when he came through the gate, sitting in the thin, early light with a blanket over her lap and 2 coffees on the small folding table. He saw her from across the garden and stopped for just a moment, the specific stop of a person recalibrating, and then came toward her with his usual steady ease. He sat down. She handed him the coffee without preamble. "I went to the potting shed this morning," she said. He nodded, looking out at the garden. "Thank you," she said, "for leaving it for me." He looked at her then, directly, with the quality of attention she had come to understand as particular to him. Not the attention of someone assessing, but of someone genuinely present. "I didn't do anything," he said. "Yes, you did," she said. "You did exactly what needed doing. You do that." She paused. "I've been watching you do that for 11 days, and I haven't said it clearly. You see what something needs and you give it that without making a production of it. Without needing credit. That is—" She stopped, looking for the word. "That is a rare thing. I'm not sure I've seen it before." He was quiet for a moment. The fountain ran behind them, steady and soft. A crow called from somewhere in the high oaks near the property edge. "Your father was a good designer," he said finally. "He was," she said. "He gave it up too early." A pause. "I didn't buy this house for a good investment. I mean, it is one, but that's not why. I spent 11 years finding it. I didn't even fully know that was what I was doing until this morning." He looked at her carefully. "He sold it in 1993, she said. I was 7. I couldn't understand it. I thought—" She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Children think places belong to them, that the feeling of belonging to a place makes it yours. I thought this garden was mine." She glanced at the margin of a smile. "I put my name on the plans to make it official." "Smart kid," he said. "Persistent one anyway," she said. "It runs in the family." She looked at him with the clear, direct gaze she gave to things she had decided to be honest about. "I need to tell you something. Not because you need to hear it, but because I need to say it." He waited. "When you first came here and built the ramp, without asking, without making it about anything other than what it simply needed to be, something in me changed. I hadn't been able to get to that garden in 2 years, and I had told myself I didn't care, that I was fine, that the view from the window was enough." She shook her head. "I was not fine. The view from the window is not enough. I had made my whole life a window, and I had convinced myself that looking through glass was the same as being present. It isn't." Marcus was very still. "You gave me the garden back," she said simply. "I know you were just doing your job. I know that. But what happened was more than that, and I think you know it too, and I'm not—" She steadied herself. "I'm not good at this, at saying things that don't come with a slide deck and supporting data. But I'm trying." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the quiet patience, not the careful kindness, but something more open and more unguarded, the face of a man standing at the edge of something and deciding whether to step. "Vanessa," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and it sounded different than she expected, simple and serious and like something that had needed saying for a while. "I know you think I was just doing my job. Weren't you?" "Not entirely," he said. "Not after the first day. The thing between them that had been building for 11 days, that had been laying its foundations as carefully as any garden, in small stones and patient work, in soup eaten in cold November air and a child's drawing on a desk and a ramp, fitted to existing bluestone as though it had always belonged, sat between them now in the morning light, visible and real." She reached across the table. She placed her hand over his. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "I was going to anyway," he said. She did not move her hand. He turned his over gently, and her fingers settled into his palm with the specific ease of things that fit. and they sat in the early morning quiet of the recovering garden while the fountain ran and the wisteria held its bare arms wide and the south bed waited. Underground for April. But 3 days later, everything changed. The call came on a Thursday morning while Marcus was working the back lawn. His phone. A number he didn't recognize, but the area code was local. He stepped away from the cultivator and answered. "Mr. Hale?" A man's voice, clipped and precise. "My name is Jeffrey Marsh. I'm an attorney representing Coal Dynamics Board of Directors. I'm calling because we have reason to believe you may be in a position that represents a conflict of interest for our company's CEO." Marcus was silent. Ms. Cole's professional circumstances make personal entanglements with employees particularly sensitive. Marsh continued. "I want to be very clear that this call is informal. We are simply requesting that you consider the full implications of your current situation. Who authorized you to call me?" Marcus said quietly. A pause. "The board has a fiduciary responsibility." "Who?" Marcus said again. "Authorized this call." Another pause. "I'm not at liberty to say." Marcus ended the call. He stood in the back lawn with his phone in his hand, in the cold air, looking at the house. Looking at the sitting room window where, he knew Vanessa was likely in the middle of a call of her own, running the company that certain people on its board had just decided they needed to use against her. He thought carefully. He thought about Lily. He thought about the money, the Friday cash that had changed the margin of their life in ways that were not glamorous but were real. That meant Lily had a new winter coat, and he had been able to replace the truck's back tires before the ice came. He thought about what he would lose if he walked away. Then he thought about Vanessa's hand in his 3 mornings ago, about what she had said. "I made my whole life a window." About the drawings in the potting shed and the child who had written her name in the margin of her father's dream and spent 21 years finding her way back. He went inside. She was on a call. He waited in the hallway outside her office, which he had never entered, until the call ended and she appeared in her doorway and saw his face. "What happened?" she said immediately. He told her. All of it. Exactly. Her expression changed as he spoke, not crumbling, nothing so simple. It was more like watching a machine calculate, the CEO processing information and building a response in real time, quick and precise. But underneath the calculation, he could see the thing that the calculation was trying to absorb, the specific hurt of betrayal by people you have fought for. When he finished, she was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Jeffrey Marsh has represented the board since 2019, she said. "He is specifically retained by the Director of Operations, Paul Whitmore." Paul Whitmore. Marcus filed the name. "This is not the first time Paul has overstepped," she said. "But it's the first time he's gone outside the company to do it." She looked at Marcus with a directness that had nothing apologetic in it. Only a kind of fierce, clear-eyed reckoning. "I'm sorry. This is not something that should have touched you." "I'm not worried about me," he said. "You should be," she said. "Paul will not stop at a phone call if he thinks—" "Vanessa." He said her name the way he had said it 3 mornings ago. Simple and serious. "I grew up with nothing. I've worked for people my whole life who didn't think I could see them for what they were. I can see people pretty clearly." He paused. "I'm not afraid of Jeffrey Marsh." She looked at him for a long time. Something moved through her expression, complex and deep. The movement of a person recognizing another person with complete undefended clarity. "I know," she said. "I know you're not." A pause. "Stay." It was not a question. It was the thing she had been practicing saying. To the garden, to the future, to April and the bulbs underground, said now to him. Clear and unhesitating. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. But neither of them knew in that moment what Paul Whitmore had already set in motion. What would arrive the following Monday in the form of a formal board petition, 6 of 11 directors, enough to call an emergency review, claiming that the CEO of Coal Dynamics was no longer fit to execute her duties and should be transitioned to a non-executive advisory role, effectively stripping her of the company her father had built and that she had saved. That was coming. And when it came, it would be the worst thing that had happened to Vanessa Cole since the car hit her on a Tuesday night in October 3 years ago. And the person who would make the difference, who would find the thing that changed everything, would not be a lawyer or a board member or a shareholder. He would smell like outside. The board petition arrived at Vanessa's email at 7:43 on Monday morning. She read it once, completely, at her desk. Then she set her phone face down and sat in the silence of her office for 4 minutes. She knew the value of 4 minutes of genuine stillness before response. She had learned that in the hospital. She had learned it more recently from watching a man work a garden. Then she picked up the phone and called David Park. "I know," David said before she could speak. "I got it 20 minutes ago. I've been trying to call you." "I was reading it," she said. "Vanessa." "6 directors," she said. "Paul, obviously. Hendricks. The 2 independents he's been courting since Q3. Brennan, who's the 6th. A pause. "Morrison." She absorbed this. Morrison had been on the board since her father's time. She had assumed he was a fixed point. "He's 73, David said quietly. "Paul has been working on him for months. I should have seen it." "You couldn't have seen it," she said. "Neither could I." She paused. "The petition cites personal conduct inconsistent with fiduciary responsibility. That's the Marsh language. They're using Marcus." "I know. Marcus has done nothing wrong." "I know that too," David said. "But the optics, a CEO in a vulnerable position, a personal relationship with a contracted employee on her private property." "I am not in a vulnerable position," Vanessa said, with a precision that had no anger in it, only certainty. "Vanessa," David said carefully, "they have enough for the review. The review goes to shareholder vote if the board can't resolve internally. We need a response that's more than—" "I have the response," she said. "Give me 48 hours. She had thought, in those 4 minutes of stillness, of the potting shed, of her father's drawings, of Marcus finding them and waiting, of what Marcus had said on the lawn. "I can see people pretty clearly." She thought of something he had mentioned casually on the second day, examining the property's survey markers along the east edge. He had said the property lines were unusual, that the northeast corner jutted into the adjacent parcel in a way that suggested a historical agreement. He had noticed it because the old boundary stone was partially buried under the privet he had been clearing. She had filed it away as a property technicality. Now she called her real estate attorney. When Marcus arrived at 7 that morning, she was already on the terrace, and for the first time since he had known her. She looked tired, not defeated. Tired with the specific exhaustion of someone carrying something heavy over difficult ground. He sat across from her and she told him everything. The petition, the review, the 6 directors, the plan to remove her. He listened without interruption. "They're using us," she said. "Using you specifically, making the case that my judgment is compromised." "Is it?" he asked. She looked at him. "No," she said. "My judgment is the clearest it's been in 3 years, possibly in my life." A pause. "I'm not afraid of losing the company. I want you to know that I'm afraid of losing—" She stopped. "What?" She looked at the garden, at the ramp, at the path that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago, at the south bed where paper white bulbs were underground in the cold, beginning the slow work of becoming. "This," she said. "Whatever this is." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You're not going to lose this," he said. "And you're not going to lose the company. You don't know that. I know that you see things other people don't see," he said. "I know that you looked at a broken-down company and saw something salvageable. Same way I look at a neglected garden." He paused. "And I know something about this property I didn't know how to bring up yet." She looked at him. He told her about the boundary stone. She was on the phone with her attorney within the hour. What Marcus had noticed, and what he articulated with the precise spatial memory of a man who had spent his life reading land, was that the northeast corner of the Birchwood property included a strip of land that had been informally absorbed into the adjacent parcel over time, but which the original deed, filed in 1938, clearly assigned to Birchwood. The value of this discrepancy was not primarily financial. The value was what was on it. A deeded conservation easement, placed by the original owner, that restricted any development or executive use change of the primary residence. Paul Whitmore's argument to the board rested partly on the claim that Vanessa was using company resources, specifically her teleconference systems and data servers, through a property that could be subject to a change of use reclassification if she were operating a de facto business headquarters there. It was a technical argument, obscure and aggressive, the kind that sounded trivial until it gave 6 nervous directors cover to act. The conservation easement made it moot. The property was legally protected as a private residential use in perpetuity. Whitmore's technical argument collapsed, but it was what her attorney found while pulling the original deed that changed everything completely. The deed from 1938 listed the original owner of 14 Birchwood Lane as one Robert A. Cole. Not a coincidence of names, the same family. A great-uncle Vanessa had known only vaguely, her grandfather's older brother, who had never married and who had died in the 1960s, leaving his estate in a trust that had eventually dissolved. The property had left the family in 1971, changed hands 4 times, been bought by Vanessa's father in the early 1980s, sold again in 1993. But the original deed had never been superseded. The conservation easement, placed by Robert A. Cole in 1945, had been recorded and had simply been overlooked by every subsequent transaction. This was not just a legal technicality. This was a story. And Vanessa's attorney, who had practiced real estate law for 30 years and knew how stories played, understood immediately. The board review convened on Wednesday. Vanessa appeared on screen from her sitting room, behind her visible through the open door. The garden in its winter clarity, the fountain running, the wisteria bare and patient along the pergola. She had positioned her screen deliberately. She wanted them to see where she was. She wanted them to see what it was. She presented her case with the precision of someone who had been doing this her entire adult life, but with something added now, a quality of groundedness, of being rooted in something real that had not been there before. She dismantled Whitmore's legal argument in 7 minutes. She addressed the conflict of interest allegation directly and without defensiveness. Mr. Hale was contracted to restore the estate grounds and has done so with exceptional quality and professionalism. The personal respect that has developed between us represents no conflict with my duties to this company, as the past 3 weeks of operational performance data will confirm. She presented the Q4 projections, the Denver partnership close. She had annotated the contract personally, and it had been executed 2 days prior, and the conservation easement documentation. Then she told them about the deed. She told them that the property had been in her family since 1938, that her great-uncle had placed a conservation easement on it in 1945 that no subsequent owner had known about or honored, that her father had bought it back in the early 1980s without knowing the full history, had planned a garden there that existed in detailed drawings currently stored in the estate's original potting shed, and had been forced by circumstance to sell it in 1993 when she was 7 years old, that she had spent the better part of her adult life finding it again. "I did not come to this property for strategy," she said. "I came here because it is mine. It has been mine in one sense or another for my entire life, and what I have found here in the past 3 weeks." She paused, and in the pause, she allowed herself, briefly, to be a person rather than a CEO, which was the bravest thing she had done in a boardroom since she was 24. "What I have found here has made me a better executive, a better person. I do not need this board's permission to say that, but I am saying it, on the record, because the truth of how I am doing my job should not be separate from the truth of who I am." Morrison asked the first question after she finished. His voice, which she had not heard in months, was quiet. "Vanessa," he said, "your father would be proud." The vote was 9-2 in her favor. Paul Whitmore and 1 independent director. Whitmore resigned the following morning. Marcus was in the garden when she came to tell him. He was at the south bed. She had come to know the particular shape of him crouched at the earth, intent and still. And he looked up as she came down the ramp, and she came across the garden to him and stopped when she was close. And the thing she had been holding carefully for 3 weeks was simply in her face now, no longer contained, warm and clear, and undefended. 9-2, she said. He stood. He looked at her with the same full, unhurried attention he gave to everything. "You are never going to lose it," he said. "I know," she said. "But it's good to be sure." She reached up, and he leaned down slightly to meet her, and she kissed him once gently. In the garden her father had drawn and her great-uncle had planted and the world had taken from her family 3 separate times. In the cold December air, beside the fountain that was running and the wisteria that was dormant and the south bed where 6 varieties of bulbs were underground, doing their slow, invisible, essential work. He held her face in both hands, careful, warm, as though she were something precious that had been a long time finding its right place. And she held his forearms with her own hands, and they stayed like that for a moment. In the quiet of the garden, in the particular peace of 2 people who have arrived. Lily, who had come today with her father because the Hendersons had a Christmas party, appeared at the corner of the terrace. She assessed the situation with her usual 6-year-old gravity. She was wearing the yellow rubber boots. She was holding a new stick. "Are you in love?" she asked. Marcus looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at Marcus. Something moved through both of them like light through water, clear and warm and entirely real. "Yes," Vanessa said. Lily considered this. "Okay," she said with the tone of someone who had suspected as much for some time. She shuffled off on her wide-footed boot walk toward the rose beds where she had ongoing private business. Marcus laughed, quiet and full, the laugh of a man who had been carrying a great deal for a long time and had just set it down somewhere safe. Vanessa took his hand. They stood together in her father's garden, which had waited for her across decades and distances, and the particular losses that make people forget what they are waiting for. Around them, the grounds held the specific quiet of a place that was loved again. The fountain steady at the center, the paths clear and purposeful, the beds resting in the cold with their invisible cargo of coming color. In April, the paperwhites came up first along the south path, white and clean and indifferent to everything except light. The iris followed in May, old Dutch varieties purple and gold, crowding the bed with a generosity that surprised even Marcus. By June, the wisteria was in full bloom along the pergola, and Lily drew it from above in her notebook with the mapmaker's instinct that had been hers since before she could explain it. Vanessa went to the potting shed one morning in late April and brought out her father's drawings, carefully, in a portfolio she had ordered for the purpose. She spread them on the dining room table, the full 11 from 1985 to 1991, and studied each one. Then she called an architect. She was not going to rebuild the garden exactly as her father had planned it. That wasn't the point. The point was to finish what he had begun, in the way that a person finishes something for love rather than completion, not erasing what the years had made of it, but adding to it, carrying it forward. Marcus sat beside her at the table with his notebook, and they talked for 3 hours about what the garden wanted to be, and what it already was, and what it had been, and how those 3 things were not as different as they might seem. Lily fell asleep on the couch with her stick in her boot and her marker-stained hands folded under her cheek. What Marcus Hale had come to understand, in the particular school of this place and this woman and this season, was something he had been circling his whole life without landing on. That the most important work was not the visible work. It was not the ramp or the cleared paths or the trained wisteria or the repaired fountain. The most important work was the kind you did below the surface in the cold without guarantee. The work of trusting that what you planted would come up, that what you opened could stay open, that the things you gave without asking for credit were precisely the things that grew. And what Vanessa had understood, sitting at her window for 2 years, looking at a garden she could not reach, building a life around windows and glass and distance, was that the longing you carry for the longest time is usually not for a place or a company or a version of yourself you've lost. It is for someone who sees you clearly, not the performance of you, not the function of you. You, with your wheels and your losses and your father's drawings sleeping in a shed and your 7-year-old handwriting in the margin of a dream. Someone who shows up with muddy boots and builds you a path to the thing you'd given up believing you'd ever reach again. Someone who, when you ask him to come back tomorrow, was already planning to. Outside the dining room window in the April light, the garden was in full early bloom, white and green in the particular gold of a morning that has been a long time coming. The fountain ran. The wisteria was beginning. The paths Marcus had laid led in every direction through the grounds in clean, purposeful lines, and there was not a single step that could not be crossed, not a single part of the garden that was not reachable, not a single corner of this place that did not belong, in some whole and unhurried way, to all three of them. The garden was alive. And so, completely and without reservation, were they.